Good evening. I am delighted to be here tonight. Since so many of you are new to the National Maritime Historical Society, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you a little about it. We are the national voice of the maritime heritage, and we do that mainly through our publication, Sea History, our website, the many programs and educational programs that we put out. Our mission is to preserve and promote America's great maritime heritage. And with that said, it is my honor to introduce our chairman, Ron Oswald.
This place has fascinated so many of us, whether you saw it for the first time as you were taking the train, either up or down the river, or perhaps on an excursion cruise on the Commander. And even for those of us who have been over to the island a number of times, there's still this ongoing fascination with this place. You might ask yourself, well, how is this maritime? Well, you do have to get there by water, so I guess that qualifies. And to tell us the story of Bannerman's Island, we have the gentleman who perhaps knows more about Bannerman's Island and the story behind it than anyone else, and that's Thom Johnson. So, Thom, if you'd like to take over.
He is the first Francis Bannerman in the Battle of Bannockburn. Well, it's Francis Bannerman VI who was born in Dundee, Scotland in 1852. If you try to line up the dates of the Battle of Bannockburn and 6 generations, it really doesn't work. It would probably have to be Francis Bannerman the 10th or 12th. But it is an important part of the Bannerman family story, and it is often referred to in one of the most extraordinary publications that the Bannermans produced, and that's their catalog. And the Bannerman business was one of the very first catalog providers. And I brought a couple of the hardbound issues that, if you're interested at the end, you can look at. So that's the Bannerman name. Well, the name of the island, people call it Bannerman's Island. Well, there really is another name. And if you look on river charts, you're going to see Polypel Island, which is the true name of the island. And there are 4 possible origins to that name. The first one goes to the Native Americans, and in their language it meant the divider of the waters. And the little island is 1,000 feet offshore of the eastern shore, doesn't quite divide the waters, but it is one of the very few islands on the Hudson. The second possible origin has to do with the type of vegetation that once grew in abundance on the island, and that's a prickly pear type of cactus called the polypus. And you're going, cactus? It still grows out there. And we do have examples of it for the public to see when we do tours. The third possible origin is likely the accurate one, and it has to do with the practice that the Dutch would perform on freshman sailors as a rite of initiation. So here's another nautical theme. What they would do is dunk them into the water offshore of the island and retrieve them in a device that looks a lot like a pot ladle. And in their language, polypel means pot ladle. The reason I say it's likely the accurate origin is I've seen a map at the Smithsonian Institution. It was produced by the British shortly after they took control of this area from the Dutch. On the map, it's identified as Pot Ladle Island, or the English version of the Dutch name. Locals being locals, we maintain the name of Polypel. The final possible origin is the romantic tale of a young farm lass who's being suited by 2 young men, a Reverend Vernon and a Gert Breckerhoff. The Reverend decides to take young Polly for a horse-drawn sleigh ride on the ice offshore of the island. Gert, who's a farm lad, goes to him and says, don't do this. I mean, he's interested in this young lady and he doesn't want him to take her. But of course, the Reverend goes just the same. And so our hero Gert stays on the shore and watches. The tide shifts, the ice breaks up, they cut the horses loose, but the 2 of them end up in the water. Our hero Gert jumps onto some ice. At this point, I always say, I have been on the island, I've walked there on the ice, I don't believe this story for a heartbeat. But according to the story, Gert jumps on an ice floe, gets the 2 of them to the safety of the island, and young Polly displays such affection for her savior, and isn't it convenient that the other fella is a reverend? He marries the two of them on the spot. The next day, the Pell family slaves, and in the written versions, they are identified as slaves, are the ones who name it Polly Pell's Island or Polypel Island. Okay, going back to Mr. Bannerman. Frank Bannerman, at the beginning of the Civil War, his father goes into the service of the Union Navy. Young Francis is about 12 years old. He's now the family breadwinner. At first, he would buy and sell anything, and we have versions of his card that say that. But as he progresses through the process of purchasing surplus naval goods and other military goods for scrap value, if he cleaned it up, he could resell it for its intended purpose. So often, our government would take something like this, and this is a legitimate Bannerman's canteen from way back, came right out of the arsenal many years ago. Well, a canteen like this might have gotten a penny as scrap, but might sell for 10 cents through his catalog business for a scout who might want a canteen. So he realizes that what the government is basically selling at scrap value, he can remarket, and he creates the Army-Navy store, basically. And as the years would progress, it would grow and grow and grow. The first stores are in Brooklyn. He has a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. But when he gets into the catalog business, starting in 1884, which is the first one, which is handwritten, the first published one is 1888. By 1900, it's about a 20-page catalog. By the last one that he would supervise in his lifetime is the 1917 version. It is over 400 pages. And it is everything you could imagine, from marching drums, uniforms, suits of armor, you name it. Well, how does the island come to be? What happens is, at the end of the Spanish-American War, through the process of sealed bid, he purchases 90% of the captured military goods. Among it is a large supply of black powder. It being potentially hazardous and dangerous, he needs to find a place for safe storage. The next part of the story, there's two versions. The one that his son David would tell is that he and a friend from Newburgh were paddling a canoe and saw the island and reported back to Mr. Bannerman that there's an island where he could build a warehouse. The version that he would tell to a church group in Cornwall, New York, is that he and his wife Helen were returning from the Catskills on one of the old dayliners. They're at the rail. They see the island, and he comments to his wife Helen, "I could buy that little island and I could build a warehouse there." By the way, his wife Helen, very observant woman herself, and quite accurately turned to him apparently and said, "Frank, how could you build anything out there? There's not a flat spot." And that's pretty much true to this day. If you are coming on the hike, be prepared. It's a lot of up and down. Well, if you think about it, a guy who has a problem needing a flat spot and a lot of black powder doesn't really have a problem. And that is true, that they would use some of the black powder to blast into the island to lower the grade to start construction. Well, he doesn't own the island. Who did? The island was owned by Mary Taft of Cornwall, New York. She had purchased it in the 1880s to control the illegal alcohol and prostitution trade that once took place out there. Apparently, back in those days, it was the Studio 54 of the mid-Hudson Valley. And interesting, I will be showing a picture of one of the barges. It's a spud barge that would be tethered to the island, and it had little rooms, and that was for the prostitution trade. And if the authorities were coming, they'd pull up the spuds and floated away the barge. Okay, so he purchased the island in 1900, and construction starts in 1901. At first, all that's there is a superintendent's house, a 3-story warehouse for goods, and a small dock. Starting with that first structure and continuing throughout almost every structure on the island is the fact there are no right angles at the corners. The aerial footprint of the #1 arsenal or warehouse is that of a parallelogram. So the walls are parallel, but the corners are not to 90 degrees. Why he does this, I believe, is that he knew the concept of false perspective. And by doing that, he creates an optical illusion that the structure is larger than it actually is. Why he did that, I think, is answered in what he does immediately after the walls are built. And that is, it's whitewashed in 4.5-foot letters, Bannerman's Military Magazine, in the address of the New York store. It's a giant billboard. And as the years would progress, starting in 1905, when he would do the first expansion and build the number 2 and 3 arsenals and the harbor and breakwater, he's adding the architectural element of Scottish baronial and some Moorish elements. As the years would progress, he would add the tower, which is the main structure. You can see it's beautifully lit up in sunlight there. You have the north gate in this picture. You can see the edge of the number 1, and behind it where it says Bannerman's Island Arsenal, that's the number 3. He would also build a lodge for island workers to live. There was a superintendent's house, as well as the Bannerman family residence, which is located on the top of the island looking south towards West Point. It would continue to function as his main weekend residence and arsenal throughout his life. And when he passed, shortly after the armistice at World War I, 2 of his 3 sons would continue to run the business through their lives. By 1940, his son, number 7, was getting up there in years. He wanted to retire. They were looking to sell the business but could find no buyer. He would pass in 46. His brother David would pass in the mid-1950s. It would go into the hands of the next generation under the leadership of a grandson, Charles S. Bannerman. He incorporates the business with one of the workers in the New York store. They start closing down the island. A munitions expert spent the summer on the island in the late 50s, removing all ordnance. By about 1965, mostly unwanted stock was remaining on the island, although they did still maintain a superintendent presence there. They also closed down the store at 501 Broadway in the late 50s. They opened a new warehouse and store out at Blue Point, Long Island, and continued to run the business through there. In 1965, they published the 100-year anniversary catalog. And in 1967, with the help of the Rockefellers and the Jackson Hole Preserve, the Island Arsenal was sold, and the Bannermans would sell the business to one of the workers, Jim Hogan, who would continue to run it until just a few years ago. And as the stock wore out, and they weren't replacing stock, he basically now has sold the name of the business to a good friend of mine who owns the name but does not sell under the Bannerman brand. So in a sense, Francis Bannerman Son business, believe it or not, is still sort of out there. Okay, so that's the thumbnail sketch. And what I am going to do now is sort of take you through some of this visually. So if I could have some lights out so you can see this a little better, and see if I can get this the wrong way. Okay, this is what first brought me up here. I'm into railroads, and I saw a picture like this, the 20th Century Limited passing it. And I looked at that and I said, what is it? And enlisted a couple of friends. I grew up in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and went up there and I stood on the riprap of the river and looked across and asked the question, what is it and why is it there? And I'm still getting answers, and that's over 45 years ago. And that's really the coolest thing. You know, I think those of us who have connected to history are always concerned about the next generation, and I certainly am. I spent my life's work as a teacher at the Irvington High School. And we always want to be aware of the fact that we need to pass it on to the next generation. And fortunately, there's always some people who are coming along and filling our shoes. And they're asking some of those same questions. What is it and why is it there? Okay, that's the rare picture that I recently found showing the spud barges tethered to the island. And this is before the Bannermans even bought it. This is probably about 1890. This is a construction shot. This shows them blasting into the island, and the little building you see is the superintendent's house. Originally, the front door to the superintendent's house faced to the north. When they built around it to build the number 3 arsenal and the tower, those windows would be bricked up and turned into cabinets, and the front door would be turned into a closet. By the way, this guy was really creative in how he reused things. And when he built the harbor, he bought 6.5 acres of underwater rights on the east and south. And according to his deal with the state is, okay, you have to mark your property line. Well, he does it by buying old wooden railway transfer barges. And he fills them with riprap, and he sinks them in the pattern of the harbor arms and breakwater. When the riprap comes above the high water mark, he has them capped with the concrete walkways and, cleats and baluards, etc. And he builds those little towers. There were a total of 5 river towers that were at the gated entrance, the gap. There was one that was the Twin Towers, which is a bridge, and then all the way out at the end was the Margaret Tower. Okay, well, all of the lumber that came off of those old barges that could be reused was used to build the floors of the number 2 and 3 arsenal. And when you see some of the interior pictures and you look at these timbers, and they're huge, you also have to remind yourself that they're probably soaked in kerosene and other things from their time as a barge, basically. This is artwork showing what it looked like when it said Bannerman's Military Magazine, and you can see one of his boats. And he did have a small collection of boats, and that one was actually named the Ian. The big launch that he had was named the Palapel. This is a photograph showing the construction of the terraced wall to the north and the number 3 arsenal being constructed. This is artwork also, and it shows the other version of the tower. And we've never found a photograph of this, but there was evidence in the construction of the interior part of the walls, in particular of the main tower, that suggested there were other structures there at one point. And this artwork kind of supports that, but it also supports the fact that it's full of errors. The placement of all those windows in the number 1 arsenal is completely wrong. So it's still guesswork as to what it looked like briefly between probably 1906 and 1909. This is the main tower being built. So you can see it's going up behind where it says Bannerman's Island Arsenal. They're almost up to the point where they're building the final floor. The tower looks like it's 7 floors. It's actually 5 floors because they didn't blast into the island. What they did is they built it above the 2 floors that surrounded it. And the top 2 floors of the tower are the ones that are most festooned with architectural detailing. The corbels, the brick, the ball finials. It's really quite a fantasy of architectural elements. This is 1915, and the reason I know that is you can see what is called the lodge. Does the little, yeah, here. This is called the lodge. The bottom floor was shipping and receiving. The second 2 floors, and there's a 3rd floor up here, were living accommodations for the island workers. And you can see there's a whole group of men that are right now working on building the lodge. You can see in the background that there's a barge there, and that's one of the barges that had been sunk in place. That one lasted probably longer than any of them because it was there. There's photographs of it that I believe are in the 1930s, and this, like I said, it'd be 1915. He drew it up himself. And it's interesting how that happened. Not that he drew it, but that we have them. There's a gentleman who ran a military bookstore in New York, Mark Aziz, and actually it was in Jersey, excuse me. He basically knew that they were tearing down 501 Broadway, and he went and he kind of dumpster dove. And he got a lot of the archives and records that were just being capriciously thrown out. And the drawings were basically part of that. He would sell them to another gentleman who would then donate them to the Hagley down in Wilmington, Delaware, which is a very proper donation given the connection to DuPont's and what have you. So because of that, and they were preserved, we now have, it's about 54 pages of scraps of paper. And he was fond of, if he got a correspondence or an envelope, he'd turn it over and he'd use it to draw on, or he'd use it to write notes. And, you know, not a bad idea. So this is what is called the Sally Port. And it's the area where there was the dock. This is the area I just discussed, the lodge. There's a phony moat here. Tide went up, water went into the moat. Tide went out, the water went out, with a portcullis, and it was ramped all the way up towards the superintendent's house. So that's the drawing, and that's what it looked like. So, it's often said that it was not built well. And there were some mistakes that I think he made. Probably premier in them is one of the walls to the number 2. Apparently he was a little antsy, and he didn't allow the ground to settle long enough before he built on it. And what happens, you put weight on top of it, and it starts sinking into where it should have been a solid foundation, and it formed a crack. And pretty soon, the crack had passed through some of the doors. It's not too pretty out there in that section. But I would argue a lot of it really was very well built. And the fact that it survived the fire in 1969, which was a 3-day event, and it still has stood for all these years. Yes, there are collapses that have occurred, and you'll see some of that as I go through the show. I would argue that, a lot of it really was fairly well built. Okay, where are we? Okay, that's the gap tower. That's a 70-foot gap in between the 2 river towers. And the one to the north is completely in the river now. The one to the south, I'm amazed it stands. When I go out there at a low tide, there's maybe 8 or 10 bricks that are holding that whole thing up. How come it has not collapsed is a mystery to me. This is the Margaret Tower. This is the one that's all the way out towards the channel. If you're eagle-eyed, you can actually see, oops, wrong one. If you're eagle-eyed, that is Captain Nelson, apparently, and that's from a note that was on the edge of the photograph. But, and we believe that boat he had named the Ian, but this is the Margaret Tower. That's the Margaret Tower looking towards the Twin Towers, and it's the breakwater that runs all the way from the Margaret Tower to the Twin Towers. And on that breakwater were 6 sitting areas. And he was fond of creating these kind of places where you could sit and contemplate really one of the most extraordinary pieces of scenery in the Hudson Valley. And this is the only photograph that supports my belief that he was going to bridge this. And you can see something's going on here. And I'm pretty certain that this is 1918, which is the last year of his life. There is no evidence remaining of those walls. The Margaret Tower is standing, but that's also, it's amazing that it's still standing. The powder house, and as I already said, it did explode. They don't know what caused the explosion. It could have been just one of those flukes. I mean, black powder is potentially hazardous and dangerous, but in 1920 it exploded. A section of wall landed on the railway tracks over 1,000 feet away. It could be felt about 15 miles away, the explosion. It blew out all the windows in the main arsenal. Helen Bannerman, who was still alive, had been up at the Bannerman residence and got out of a hammock at the time just before the explosion to get a drink. And when she turned around and looked back at the hammock, a section of the wall had landed in the hammock she had just gotten out of. But the family was fond of saying that she still had it because she ran around the island putting out fires and helping deal with what resulted in the explosion. This is the first form of the Bannerman family residence. Originally, it was a one-room affair for he and his wife Helen to come up on weekends and, have a nice day or two up there. As the years would progress, they would actually tear down this section and expand it and build a dining room in there, and then above it they would build a guest room, and they would have their own bedrooms as well as a sleeping porch, etc. So even though the house still is fairly small, it had a bunch of nice little rooms. Another photograph of the Bannerman residence, and this is quite a bit later. This is probably in the early 1930s when things are starting to grow up around. Helen, who passed in the early 1930s, After she passed, the family did use it, but not a lot. They would go up there occasionally on weekends and what have you. But more often than not, it was just the families that were on the island as workers. And there were two primary families. Mr. Crawford was the island superintendent for 35 years. His nephew, Leonard Wayne Owen, was the assistant superintendent for 20 years. And they basically kept that place running quite well. This is the west wall of the number 3 arsenal or warehouse. I can't prove this, but I kind of believe, maybe because I want to believe, that he had a little office here in this area. You can see there's actually window shades and what have you. But the other piece of evidence that I used to suggest that is the interior wall at that location is finished. There's some parging of concrete that's finished, and the rest of the wall is stone, basically just field stone. So it suggests that it was done a little bit nicer for that one little section. Another thing to note is, people talk about his fondness for the cement cannonballs. Well, that always makes me a little grumpy because that's not a proper architectural term. You would likely want to call those ball finials, because they are kind of finials like the ball that you would see at the top of a bridge. But if he wanted cannonballs, wouldn't he have used real ones? Yep, he did. That's a real cannonball. That's a real cannonball. And the reason I know that is in the 60s when the island was being cleaned of artifacts and ordnance, etc., there were a number of people who were young at the time who were hired, many by Doc Fillinger, who was the medical examiner for the city of Philadelphia. And they would spend the weekends out there. They would go out there on Friday night and set up a campsite, and then they would start ferrying things off the island. And Doc Fillinger would have a box truck waiting, and they were just getting tons of packs, canteens, whatever they could buy off of the island. Well, one of those guys got permission to take those 2 cannonballs, and he still has them. In fact, he proudly has informed me that every piece of Bannerman artifact that he ever got, he still has. This is the north view of the island. You have the north gate here. This is the number 1, this is the number 3, this is the tower, etc. And this is a photograph that kind of shows the oddity of the architecture. If you had a decent high school art teacher and they taught you about drawing to perspective, vanishing points, and you had 2 vanishing points, well, you can have more than 2 vanishing points. You can have 3, you can have 4, you can have 5, you can have 6, you can have a dozen. And if you look at the walls, and you can see this is going that way, and well, this one's sort of going close to the same direction, but not quite, and this one's going a little bit different, and this one's definitely going to a different vanishing point, and that's because there are no right angles. Okay, the interior of the Bannerman residence. This is an early photograph of it. According to the family legend, that table was once owned by George Washington. Don't know that I believe it. But over the fireplace here, you have a shield, you have a little pistol and a sword and a powder horn and what have you. But you also have over here, and he was fond of putting these kinds of names to places, and that's that. Over the fireplace, it said, Jehovah is my strength and my shield. And he was a very religious man. So over the picture window of the Bannerman residence, it said, come behold the works of Jehovah. Interior of, I believe this is the tower. And you can see the condition that things had deteriorated to probably in the late 50s or early 60s. Although even at that point, this is still in pretty good shape. Could you imagine what one of those wheels is worth now? These are frame packs. I actually own one of these. I forgot I was going to bring it today. But that gives you an idea how much stuff was inside. A lot of people, they see the island while they're passing by on the train. And everybody has their own version of, wow, that's, Cinderella's castle or, whatever. And really what it was a warehouse. And he didn't manufacture there. It was purely for storage. But it was a beautiful storage space. And that's an interesting thing to think about. You know, around the time that he was doing this, it was also the City Beautiful movement in our country. And that we built buildings that really kind of said something. And I'm kind of sad that we've been kind of led into this whole mentality of we build boxes, little boxes, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky. Sound familiar? And look at this. This guy didn't have to do this. I think he did it because it was interesting to him. But I think he also realized there was value in it, not only for its posterity and for what it has turned into, and in my opinion, it's actually sculpture now. But it brought him business. You know, he got free advertising from the New York Central Railroad when they put it on the cover of their timetable. He got advertising from the Hudson River Dayliner when, you know, they did an entire, you know, paragraph or more in their guide on things to see on the Hudson. And of course, what's it going to say? To buy from this man, 501 Broadway. So it really was an advertising gimmick. An aerial, and this shows you how extensive it once was. You know, when I first stood there and looked at it, some of the harbor was still seeable. Right now, just a tiny little piece of this remains, and the rest of all of this, except for this tower, this twin tower, and this, all gone. And if you go to the shore on the east side, south of the island at dead low tide, and you look down at the ground, you will likely see little brick pebbles. They look like pebbles, but you can tell they were made of brick, clay. And they were probably part of the breakwater. And through the freeze and thaw cycle, they were transported from the island to the shore and have been worn down over the years. It's amazing what Mother Nature will do. But what you are looking at in terms of the structures is, here's the main dock. Over here, this is the number 1. This is the number 2. This is the number 3. This is the tower. Around the corner of the tower is the superintendent's house. This is called the Sally Port, where the gated entrance was, and the lodge. And then this barge, which was put there in 1905 during the first big construction push, stayed there for many years. The one rumor is that he was going to put a tennis court on it. That never happened. And then up here is the Bannerman family residence. And then if you look here, you can see railroad tracks. And that's a marine railway. And that's how he would take his vessels out come the winter. Bannerman was a very philanthropic guy, and he was a very good guy in terms of doing things with young people. One of the things that I found very appealing about this man is that at his own expense, he would pay for kids to come up from New York City on the Dayliner. He'd send his vessel to go get them. He'd bring them to the island and give them a day's adventure, probably give them a canteen or a pith helmet or something, feed them a nice meal with ice cream and what have you, and take a keepsake photograph for them. So he was kind of like being a scout leader around the same time that the scouts were first being formed. And in the background, that's Mr. Bannerman. And these are inner city kids probably around 1915. What are we doing wrong? Look at them. They're wearing ties. And we can't get our kids nowadays to pull up their pants. Look at that. I mean, these are the Bowery boys. He was also very generous during the effort during World War I. And this is an entire barge loaded with military clothing, blankets, etc., for the Belgian war relief. He also sent, I can't remember, I think it was a $20,000 check with the donation for any modifications or any of the other things with transportation, etc., to get the goods to the people who needed them. His catalog is fascinating. You know, it's also unfortunate that he's often referred to as a merchant of death because he sold military goods. I have a book written in the 30s. It's called Merchants of Death. He's an entire chapter called Used Death. Okay. You know, I write, you know, we tend to try to get titles that will get people to read it, and maybe they're a little inflammatory, and these titles I think maybe are. But the writing of the story is actually pretty accurate, because he talks about him bringing kids to the island. He talks about what Bannerman maintained at his store at 501 Broadway in the top 2 floors, which is a military museum that he referred to as the Museum of Lost Arts, because he wanted us to study war and the machinery of war to learn to no longer need it. What a great idea. And some of his biggest customers, John Philip Sousa bought uniforms. Buffalo Bill Cody bought uniforms, guns, etc. for his shows. Hollywood. You ever see an old Charlie Chan movie with all the battle axes and the old guns as stage sets and what have you? All came from Bannerman's. So here's a page from the catalog showing uniforms that were for sale. Oh, by the way, he also had a group of tailors, a small army of tailors working for him. But it did burn in 1969, and this is a fire depicting a painting depicting the fire of '69. It did burn for 3 days, and from my viewpoint, it left a giant piece of sculpture. So now we're going to visit it more recently. And this photograph was shot by a gentleman by the name of Mike Kanzian. And when I was doing the Arcadia book, I was put in touch with him because he had been on the island in the early 1960s a couple of times, and he had taken a lot of photographs. So I met with him. He gave me everything he had, and I was able to access and use it all. And when I returned all of his material with a copy of the book and a thank you, he was very appreciative, so much so, and to me this is a great compliment that he would pay me. About a month later, I got home, and there's a huge package in my mailbox. He had mailed everything back to me. And Mike's up there in years, and he says, "You're the guy that should have this." So I ended up with the entire Mike Kanzian archive, and I'm very proud of that. But this is one of his photographs. This is taken from the shore. And this is really what I think I really remember from when I first stood on the shore, that it looked pretty much like that. This is it, probably about 25 years ago. By the way, you can see the little markers there. They're submerged obstruction markers. Myself and a couple of other folks with the Bannerman Castle Trust, we put them in, I think it was on a Saturday. By Sunday, a guy had put his donzi right on the old breakwater, right next to a submerged obstruction buoy. What can I tell you? I'm a member of the Peekskill Yacht Club, and I'm a great believer that we really should be licensing all boating. I mean, you know, just people out there get a boat and start moving it. It's a little scary. But it's, at this point, still standing tall and proud, and sadly, as you will see, we have lost this. In the winter of 2009, 2010, that did collapse. And we are losing more and more of it. But as you will see, there is a great effort to not only stabilize, but preserve and maintain for the future. This is another one of Mike's shots showing the tower in its glory and all the details that were on the top of the tower. This is one of my shots from when I first went out there looking up also at the tower. That little thing here, this is called a faggot burner. And a faggot is basically, the proper definition of it is a group of hardwood sticks lashed together for illumination. And Bannerman did not have electricity out there. His sons would put a generator in there in the 1920s. But that was how they would illuminate it at night. And they would basically use like oil rags or something and light it up. Sadly, in the very beginning of the Bannerman Castle Trust, that disappeared. Whether or not somebody climbed up there and removed it, or it fell down and somebody just came upon it and walked away with it, I do not know, but it's unfortunate because that was a real historical piece. As I think I said, I walked out there on the ice. I don't do that easy, and I don't do it alone. In fact, I don't think I'm ever going to do it again. But because of that, I got some great shots. And this place is hard not to take a good picture of. Not only for the physical beauty of the landscape surrounding it, and you got to remind yourself, you're at the north gate to the Hudson Highlands. But it really is quite extraordinary what Francis Bannerman designed and built there. Another one from that same day. Just that to me is the quintessential winter shot of the tower. He did sign it. You can't really read it here, but it says Francis Bannerman VI, Palapel Island. And there were shields there. There were probably a total of 20 different shields. Some of them might have been the rampant lion, some of the Scottish flag, etc. On the north side of the island, you're seeing the sign in 4.5-foot letters that proclaimed Bannerman's Island Arsenal. An interesting oddity. On this side, it says Bannerman's S apostrophe. On the other side, on the east side, it says apostrophe S. I don't know. One side's possessive? Okay. I love this shot. It's looking at the Margaret Tower and towards Cornwall. In the background, you can see the Cornwall Yacht Club. In fact, you can even see they have, right up here, the Armistead is a schooner barge that was part of the New York, Ontario, and Western's fleet. Up until the late 1950s, there was a huge coal tipple and transfer point for coal from the New York, Ontario, and Western Railway to vessels there. And when they went out of business in the late 1950s, that area slowly became the landing down at, was it Donahue Park in Cornwall, and the Cornwall Yacht Club used the barge as a breakwater. Looking south towards the South Gap Tower, and by the way, if you like taking photographs, you do it at sunrise and sunset. This was about 5:30 in the morning, sometime around this time of year in the summer. And you can see the moisture's coming up off of the river. But another thing that's cool is, I don't know if you can really make that out, but that's the prow of a boat. And, you know, he did sink all these vessels to create the breakwater, and that's one part that it's still there. It's very cool looking. The tower reflected in the little harbor bay there. Because Bannerman would bring kids to the island, I have done the same thing, and I did teach for many years at the Irvington High School. The first group of students I took were from the Irvington High School. This is a group of kids that are Sea Scouts, and they are from the ship that is connected to the Peekskill Yacht Club. And so what they had the experience of is we boated up, we set up a camp, they did some trail work and cleaning up. They were able to camp overnight and have all kinds of fun and experiences playing in the dark at Bannerman's. And then the next day, boated back. They had a great adventure. And I always say Mr. Bannerman would give me an attaboy for that, because this is the kind of thing that I think made a lot of sense to him. So, a bunch of Sea Scouts. And it's raining, and look at all the smiles. Here are some of the gardeners, and over the years, in fact, this young lady is Donna Blakemore, and she's the lead gardener out there. And today, her and probably most of the people in this picture were out there working on the gardens. One of the things that happened when we researched the book, we did find Helen Bannerman, her planting lists. And with the help of the Cornell University Master Gardeners, we were able to recreate what educationally seems to be the best choices, what the gardens looked like. And if you go out there now, or I hope many of you will go on the tour, you'll be able to see what the gardens now look like. And that's down in the Wee Bay Gardens. This is the coolest thing that's happened this year. And this photograph was actually shot in the fall of last year. And what you see are seniors at West Point, and they're out of the engineering part of their program. And from my viewpoint, this is what education should be. Standardized testing has nothing to do with this in my mind. This has to do with real-world experience. And what the cadets did is I provided them with a couple of photographs of a bridge that once existed that went from the rear of the Bannerman residence across to the west side of the island, where there were only some flagpoles. And the bridge that he had there was really kind of quirky, as lots of the stuff was. It wasn't really founded to the ground. He ran lumber across, and he used trees. So he just nailed the lumber straight into trees. And that's what he basically created kind of the foundation out of, is living trees. One of the trees still has a board nailed to it, and it's still growing. Go figure. But what you're seeing is the cadets are now out there. They're taking all the measurements necessary to figure out, with the help of the photographs that I provided them with, to make 3 presentations. They were broken up into 3 different groups. And we went back to meet with them 2 times at West Point. They each got like 10 minutes to pitch their concept of what the bridge should look like based on the information we gave them. After the first go-around, we gave them feedback, and then they came back, or we came back, a couple months later, and we picked the one that we felt was the best. And then they built it at West Point. And then it was taken apart, brought to the island, and built. So there's the bridge. And it is remarkable in terms of, although it isn't exact to what Bannerman built, come on, it's very similar. And, you know, we had to now kind of do that fancy dance between what are proper codes for nowadays and still honor the heritage of the structure. The Bannerman residence, a number of years ago, a roof was put back on it. The windows were battened up again, and it was basically stabilized. And now that has been completed, and we are now, and some of the last pictures you'll see show a different part of the Bannerman residence where an enormous amount of amazing masonry. And the gentleman that's doing the work, again, I said to him, he's an artist. I mean, what he is doing to recreate this is pure artwork to me. I've had good fortune in a lot of my experiences, and one of them is about 20 years ago, Deke Zerjian, who's an Emmy Award-winning lighting designer, he's done television, he's done all kinds of things. And he wanted to light up Bannerman's as part of the first Riverfest. So approached us, yeah, we could do this. And I worked with him. It was a week-long project where basically I was living on the island and commuting to work. And we floated out generators, $100,000 worth of lighting equipment, lighting boards, the whole 9 yards for theater lighting. And we lit it up at night. And this is one of a number of images that I was able to create using that lighting. Well, one of the interesting things that happens is, part of my job, I taught theater craft at the Irvington High School. Students of mine saw this, or saw the photographs, I should say, and immediately go, can we do this? And I'm just sucker enough to say, okay, I'll see what I can do. And I actually got a grant, and we did it again. And we did it this time for students. So Deke didn't design it. I didn't design it. We made the kids design it. And we also brought a marching band out there, a small marching band, and some girls did some Scottish-flavored dancing and what have you. Again, Mr. Bannerman would give me an attaboy. And that leads us to the current lighting, and this has been up for the past 2 years. I helped facilitate this. This is called Constellation. Melissa McGill is a local artist from Beacon. She wanted to do something that was very community-based. And so I took her out there. It took her a while to figure out what she wanted to do, and then she said, I'd like to do a lighting project, so then I go get Deke. And we had a lot of fun playing with this because we were shooting lights across the river at each other, trying to figure out what was going to be the correct intensity. How do we do this? It's all LED lights, and it's solar powered. And what happens is there's 17 of these poles, and at the top of them are globes. In the globe are 3 LED lights that are focused in 3 different directions. And as the sun disappears, these come on, and they look like stars. And her idea was to make a new constellation kind of hovering over the ruins, which is really quite successful. I've been out there many times when you sit there and you start to see the lights go on. And they do offer special tours. You can look it up through the Bannerman Castle Trust, or you could probably also look it up through Melissa McGill. Just interior of some of what has gone on in terms of the recreation of the interior of the Bannerman residence. And like I already said, it's been battened up, and it looks even better than this now. We added some murals. And there you have Helen and Frank proudly looking at their gardens. And the mural in the center is what you would have seen had you looked inside of Bannerman's in 1918. Another thing that I think has been great is I've worked with some at-risk youth and getting some kids out there, pulling weeds and doing some good physical work, I think is always the good thing. So here are 2 young men who managed to get lucky and spend a day working with me in the gardens. But yes, we did lose a lot of it. And this is shortly after the second collapse. This would be the spring of 2010. And I'm the first one to admit, I crawled all over this place. And it's impossible now for me to go inside it. I really have a hard time walking in there. Even though nobody would stop me. It's just depressing because, it's kind of like losing a friend. Okay. This thing is making me a little crazy. Here we go. Okay. I threatened to bring the nautical thing, okay? So here's a page from the catalog. And here you see naval relics. You could buy a capstan. Wouldn't you like one of those in your yard? I would. And there's his vessel, the Polypel. That is such a cool looking boat. And actually it's still out there. It sank in a 1950s hurricane. And so I've been told, and I think I know where it is, but it's down in the muck, in probably in awful shape. But what is it holding? Over 600 crutches that were being shipped to the war relief. And here are goods being also shipped to the Belgian war relief. So you can see he's got a little tug and the barge, and they're getting ready to pull it away. Look at the boats. Look at all these really interesting looking, do you call that a Johnny boat? They all, some of these things, like this one right here, really does look kind of home built with whatever was available, which is kind of very Bannerman-like. But here's the tug pulling the barge away. This is actually connected to a famous story. At the end of his life, he was selling 6-inch naval cannons. He had bought them in, I believe it was 1911, and brought them to the island. There were 30 of them. He cleaned them up, created new mounts and sights, and offered them for sale. It first appears in the 1915 catalog. In 1918, he is now thinking he's got a sale offshore, meaning foreign government. And when he would do a sail offshore, he would contact Washington. He contacts Washington, and basically they're interested in buying him for the war effort. So Mr. Bannerman says, nope, I will sell them to my government, the American government. And so they were sold at the cost that he was charging, but he donated two for free, plus a $20,000 donation and what have you. I cannot prove what I'm about to say, so I have to give that caveat. But it is an oddity that shortly after this is all happening, he's accused of profiteering. And a sub chaser, or some kind of a naval vessel came up, and the island was occupied by our Navy for 8 months. And they were looking for evidence that Mr. Bannerman was first profiteering. What they did find was Charlie Kovacs, and he was the island's superintendent at the time. He was Austrian. Well, that was close enough to German, and they arrested him. So this gets, typical back and forth of the media in those days. Anyway, so these are the cannons on the cannon dock, and it was never proved. In fact, there was nothing proved. He was eventually exonerated, and so was Charles Kovacs. And the pardon for Mr. Kovacs is printed in my book. But it's kind of unfortunate that at the very end of his life, there's this big negative spot. If you are interested in more on this, my friend Larry Simkin did a phenomenal article just on that whole topic for the Military Collectors and Historians publication. So these are the cannons being shipped off of the island. And one of the vessels that was connected to the cannons. And it's not the sub-chaser, and I can't remember what it really was. But this is the actual vessel that laid off the island for 8 months. By the way, the naval personnel apparently stayed on the island in the top of the tower for the 8 months that they were there. And from what I'm told, Mr. Bannerman, or I guess it was his sons, because Bannerman dies 5 days after the armistice to World War I, which is really unfortunate, that he didn't get a chance to live longer and live in some peaceful times. But the sons would have been the ones that supposedly sent the government a bill for quartering the naval personnel on the island. I had to throw this picture in. One of the things that Mr. Bannerman's sons did, during his lifetime, he wanted to do a book called Weapons of War. And it was never finished. And if you read some of the catalogs shortly after Mr. Bannerman had passed, in, say, the 1920s, they would mention, we are working on the Weapons of War book, because it was known amongst collectors and what have you that he had been doing this. The last couple of years of the catalogs, starting in, I guess, the late 1940s, David, the younger of the sons, published in the back of the catalog parts of what his father had compiled. And so he has these illustrations of all sorts of different things that he came up with, including this. I have no idea what kind of a vessel this is. I saw this thing, and I had to blow it up because it's a tiny little line drawing. And can anybody help me? What's that? Well, it's like rowing, You never see where you're going when you're rowing.
Looks like lines at different types.
You're probably right.
Because you have the ram, the oars, the steering. No such thing existed. Yeah.
I knew that.
A little bit of a Greek triarine, a little bit of a hog, all kinds of different.
Yeah. It's cool looking, though.
Maybe that's the whole thing.
What do you mean?
Well, the whole history of the vessels of war.
Oh, there you go. It's the multi-warship.
Designed for him by Roosevelt.
Yeah. This is another Naval Connect. That is Admiral Farragut's personal cannon. And it was kind of a display piece on the north side of the island. That cannon was removed in either the late 1950s or early 60s. From what I understand, the person who removed it never actually paid for getting it, but did get it. It went to Hagerstown, Maryland, where it sat in the parking lot of, I believe it was a Holiday Inn, and then disappeared mysteriously in the middle of the night. I'm impressed. I don't want to meet the guy that did that. But there was information cast into the concrete, some of which we've salvaged, that referenced that and Farragut. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with a couple of pictures just of what I, again, think of as sculpture, because it's such a beautiful structure. Or structures, I should say. You know, there are many things, and it really is very nautical. By the way, if you look carefully up at the top, that's a rope pattern. And rope, very nautical necessity. The reason the rope pattern was used is one of the things that he did as a young lad to make money is he would retrieve rope at the Brooklyn waterfront that he could resell. Some to the paper trade, some to be reused as rope. So in many ways, his architecture is truly a self-portrait. The Bannerman residence. This is before we got to working on it. The tower in all its glory prior to it collapsing. And after the collapse, yes, it has been stabilized. So here you can see the bracing is going up. This is the Bannerman residence as it appears. Actually, this was about 2 weeks ago. So you can see a lot of work has been done and will continue to be done throughout this construction season. But this is the part that I think is most extraordinary. When I first went out there, all of this was pretty much intact. And over the years, vandals removed, in particular, that one column, which was one of these things like, I don't believe you people are chipping away at this. Don't you realize you have a ruin over your head? But this gentleman who's doing it, the mason, is just unbelievable in terms of I've given him some not so great photographs, and he's been able to piece it back together again like this. Sadly, though, I think he's going to have to live 1,000 years to try to rebuild it all. This is the second to last photograph I'm going to show you. I started with this photograph, and I tend to end with it. I call it my be prepared photo. I was out on the island, and this is 20-some-odd years ago, around the time the trust first got started, with a fellow paddler. We had paddled out in a canoe. It was a crummy day, and we'd gone out there to take care of some stuff, and then we were going to leave. And so we're getting in the canoe, and I suddenly look to the west, and I see that the tower, the Margaret Tower, is being lit up. And what has happened is the clouds have broken, and the sun is now setting, and it's glowing. You know, sunrise and sunset are the best times to take photographs. So I yelled to the guy, Jim, who was paddling with me, no, let's go that way. And I went around the backside of the island, and I took 88 pictures with 2 cameras in about 15 minutes. This is the most published photograph I've ever taken. And it was because I was prepared to do it. Even though it was a crummy day, I still had a couple of cameras with me so that I could record if necessary. And to me, this photograph also just sums up how extraordinary a structure Francis Bannerman VI created. And there is Mr. Bannerman in all his glory at his desk in New York City at 501 Broadway. And I always end with any similarities in go figure. That has been a running gag for years that I kind of look like him. I thank you.